Thank you, everybody, for being here for the third installment of our Michigan Millage series. This week, we are talking about the legal do's and don'ts of campaigning and yes committees for libraries, boards, and friends groups. We have with us attorney Kendall O'Connor. She is from the law firm of Fahey, Schultz, Burdick and Rhodes. And she is they represent several libraries in the state. They are one of the attorneys that, if you've seen my list of attorneys, they're on that list. Without further ado, let's go ahead and I'm going to introduce Kendall O'Connor.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. Hi, everyone. My name is Kendall. Like Claire mentioned, I am an attorney at Fahey, Schultz, Burdick, Rhodes. We're located in Okemos, Michigan. I myself live in Lansing, so you may notice that I am working from home, and I do work from home. So I'm in Lansing right now, but we are located in Okemos. We do have a multitude of practices. I would say my primary practice is municipal law, but I do, and we have multiple library clients as well that we service. So I'm very familiar with public bodies, right, and advising public bodies. Love working for you all. So happy to present on this today as it is an important topic. I will say also, I am a little bit more of an informal presenter. So to the extent, I don't know, you expect a little bit more of a formal presentation, I will say I'm a little bit more informal. So like Claire mentioned, as we go, if you want to throw things in the chat, I'll try to answer those as I go. And then kind of my vocab and my just general demeanor is just more informal. So I'm giving you a heads up right now so that as we're going through the presentation, you're not like, who is this girl? I thought she was an attorney. I am. But I also am Kendall. So that is my intro, and then my pronouns are she, her, to the extent you want to address me. I unfortunately do have to provide this general disclaimer, right? I'm sure you see these with all presentations that are provided by attorneys. You know, we got to provide it to you, so I'm going to do it here. This is my disclaimer. This presentation and the materials associated with it are comprised of general information, right? Not intended as legal advice related to specific questions of attorney-client privilege. If you do have specific questions, we would advise that you contact your attorney to get assistance related to those specific legal issues. And now we got that disclaimer out of the way, right? Let's talk about a little bit about why we're here. So I just want to Claire give a little bit of background there, but I kind of wanted to touch on where I think you guys have been already in this webinar series so that there isn't really any confusion as I present forward and you're not like, Kendall, why don't you even tell me what a millage is to begin with? Well, I hope that we've already covered that. We're a little bit more on into the process now. I know that this is at least a 3-part, maybe 4-part, but I know I am the third 4-part. And so I know I'm the third. So prior to this presentation, right, there's been presentations already on funding and determining the amount of a proposed millage. And then there's also been presentations on the types of library millages, the authority to level, millage limits, millage language, millage dates, and the millage proposal process. So I just wanted to put that out there in front, just so we all know where we've been, right, and for our roadmap going forward. So why are we here today, right? Of course, why are we here today? It's an important question. You are all spending your personal time or professional time with me, right? And I'm spending mine with you because I think that this is an important topic. I think that Michigan libraries are important. I think that everyone would agree on this chat or in this call, hopefully, right? And I think a lot of Michigan citizens would agree as well that we want to protect and we want to keep funding our public libraries. And millages are important for our public libraries. Of course, millages are going to be subject to voter approval. So when we're going for a millage, we're going to have to get that voter approval. And that's important because a lot of libraries depend on locally dedicated millages for their funding. The Michigan Library Association reports that 77% of funding is from locally dedicated millages, right? So here we're going to talk about millage campaigning. How do you begin planning for a successful millage campaign? That's all important because you want to make sure your millage passes. You want to make sure you have a successful millage proposal. So it's never too early to begin planning. I hope this presentation provides you kind of the legal parameters of, okay, what can I do and what can't I do? Gives you general baselines so that you can bring those back to your libraries when you're considering how to move forward with your millage proposal, how you want to get involved, and how you would even be able to do that, right? So I'm hoping this provides you the framework, and then you can bring this back and apply this in your specific millage, right? You'll now know, oh, I'm not sure if that's something I can do. I think I might have to contact legal, right? So this is kind of the, hey, I'm putting the flags in your head that sometimes there's legal parameters that you're not gonna be able to do certain things in millage campaigns, but we want a successful millage, so we want to be able to plan for that. And then of course, right, no one wants to talk about it, but if you lose a millage, you may have the doors closed on your library permanently. So it's important to know how to best advocate for your millage, as like what I was just discussing, right? So then today, specifically, as I move forward, I'm going to kind of be touching on, and Claire mentioned this as well, I'm going to be touching generally on legal issues involving libraries and villages, but then also yes committees, friends groups, campaigning in general, and campaign financing. So one element of it I'm going to discuss very soon is ballot question committees. Here I'm talking about, right, never too early to begin planning for a successful millage campaign. If a ballot question committee is something that is going to be in a successful millage campaign, that's something that you're going to want to plan in advance, because I will show you why. There are legal requirements for a ballot question committee, right? So just one example of why it's important to start thinking of these ahead of time and not right up when your millage is on the ballot. Okay, I wanted to introduce the main players, right? Who am I going to be talking about? Make sure we're on the same page. Of course, I'm talking about the libraries. I'm talking about library boards. I'm talking about library directors, library staff. I'm also going to touch on ballot question committees, like I mentioned, and friends of the library. So when I'm discussing these in the presentation, I want everyone to kind of acknowledge and recognize that as I'm moving forward, I am presenting from the public side. So I'm more so providing advice with respect to library. Well, this isn't legal advice, right? But I'm providing guidance with respect to libraries, library boards, and library directors. That's how I approach this presentation from that side, not so much as the ballot question committee or the friends of the library. I'm going to touch on those and how they may interact with the library and the library board and the library director. So we'll discuss how these players act independently and then also interact with one another during a millage campaign, but my focus is definitely on library and library actors. Okay, and after I say it, my focus is on library actors, right? I go straight to ballot question committees, because that's what I want to talk to you guys about what they are, right? Because they are a player here, and they may be very important in a successful campaign. So ballot question committees are created under the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, the MCFA, and as they are required to be established as soon as an organization or a group of people receive $500 in contributions or independent expenditures totaling $500 in a calendar year. And that is for the purpose of influencing voters for and against the qualification, passage, or defeat of one or more ballot questions in Michigan. Okay, so if you are receiving $500 or a group of persons, you're receiving $500 in contributions or independent expenditures for the purpose of influencing voters, which, right, is typically what is attempting to be done in a ballot campaign, is we want to have that passage, right? The ballot question committee, if you're receiving expenditures for that purpose, you have to complete or you have to establish one of these committees within 10 calendar days. And that's just on a form that you would register with the state. So I'm going to show you guys that form in a little bit, but I do want to note that this is created under the MCFA, right? So it's separate and distinct from libraries. These are often referred to as yes committees, but I do want to note that they can be organized as pro or anti-ballot measures. So when you're thinking of ballot question committees, you may be thinking of a yes committee, but a committee could also be a no committee, right? A committee could be organized to be anti-ballot measure. And then I provided the statutory citations to the extent you want to do some fun reading in your free time. A little bit more about ballot question committees, although I do have another slide and we'll talk about them more. But free reading for you guys all, which I'm sure you would love to do. At the end of the day, though, remember, these are going to be the vehicle used for fundraising purposes, right? So if there's going to be fundraising, this is something that you should click in your head and you're going to think, oh, fundraising purposes, I think a ballot question committee is probably going to be the vehicle we're going to need to use to do that. Okay, like I mentioned, my first bullet point here is saying ballot question committee is separate and distinct from the library or the library board. Like I said, library question committees, ballot question committees are established under the MCFA. Libraries have their own enabling acts, and the ballot question committees are now established under the library enabling acts, right? They are completely separate. I know the next question I'm probably going to get is, okay, Kendall, well, I am a library staff or official or director. You're saying it's separate and distinct from the library or the library board. Does that mean that I could be on a ballot question committee? Yes, but I would say there are some parameters with respect to your position as a library official, which we will touch on later on in this presentation. But generally, yes, right? You are able to be a part of a ballot question committee, even if you are a library official or an employee. You can be part of these committees. I would say I would check your conflict of interest provisions for your position. And then also, typically what is advised is that if you do end up contributing your personal time, right, your personal resources to a ballot question committee, that you should avoid chair positions to avoid conflicts of interest. So I will say that off the bat, right? And that's going to be the same for friends groups. So yes, you can get involved in friends groups, but you're not going to want to hold a chair position to avoid conflicts of interest. Okay, they're all going to be separate and distinct. And really, in your head, when you're thinking about if you hold multiple different, I don't want to say positions, but let's say you're involved, right? You have a library position, but then you're also involved in the ballot question committee or a friends group. You want to keep those in your mind as separate and distinct. Your position in the library will have no bearing on your ballot question committee position, right? So in your head, just keep those distinct at all times. And I think even having that distinction will help you move forward in how you're able to even deal with these situations and work with these groups. Okay, Michigan Bureau of Elections generally oversees ballot question committees. And then, like I said, it requires the filing of a statement of organization. I'm going to show you guys that form, so at least you guys know at least what it looks like. But it's not expensive, so I did want to provide it to you. But you do have to require the filing of a statement of organization. If it is a ballot question that is being voted on in one county, you would file the statement with the clerk of that county. If it is a ballot question being voted on for more than one county, you're going to file with the clerk of the county having the greatest number of registered voters eligible to vote on the ballot question. Now, if it's a statewide question, it's going to be filed with the Bureau of Elections. So just keep these in mind. And then also, of course, like I said, these are fundraising vehicles, right? So if there's fundraising, you're going to be under one of these committees, which means possible reporting requirements. So there are reporting requirements under the MCFA for a ballot question committee if they spend or receive in excess of $1,000 in an election. So I want to provide you guys, like I said, just with a look at that form. So here is the state of Michigan's form for establishing a statement of organization form, right, for a ballot question committee, and filed with the county clerk, like we discussed, right? I will say, again, not extensive, right? Name of committee, mailing address, treasurer name. Really what people indicate is that this is 8 and 9 is the most difficult part of establishing a committee. Who's going to be your treasurer and who's going to be your designated record keeper? So keep in mind, this is the form. Here I mentioned a reporting waiver or reporting requirements. Again, I mentioned that there may be reporting requirements if you exceed $1,000. In this form, if you're going to establish a ballot question committee, you can apply for a reporting waiver if you do not think that you're going to spend or receive in excess of $1,000 in an election. So you can just apply for that reporting waiver, and then you would not be required to file reporting requirements. However, like in the next box, you'll see if you do think that you're going to spend or receive in excess of $1,000, you may have reporting requirements. So keep that in mind. And then you're just going to have your bank. You're going to list the specific ballot proposal involved that you are opposing or supporting, right? And verification. And then there's additional instructions here in the form to provide you with kind of what we've already talked about when you need to establish a ballot question committee, right? If you're receiving or spending over $500 or more to influence voters. So I point this out to you all because not only will you have my presentation, right? But then I also do think once you look at the resources provided by the state, there is a lot of instructions. It's just, you have to read through it and make sure that you are complying, right? But the resources are out there. And so here is the form. And then, Claire, if I change I'm assuming my share did not. Did my share, are you guys now seeing a campaign finance disclosure requirement? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so then I wanted to show you guys here. Let's say you say, oh gosh, Kendall, well, I do think I'm going to spend more than $1,000 for an election, or when I say me, right, I'm referring to a ballot question committee. My ballot question committee does think we're going to spend more than $1,000. Here is the reporting requirements. You have a schedule that they provide that you're going to have to report by. So I just wanted to provide that information to you. I don't want to go too far in depth because, like I said, my focus is kind of on the library here, but I wanted to present the information so you at least know where to go to find it, right? If you need it. Okay, and I'm going to switch back to my presentation here. Hopefully I'm not making anyone dizzy on this side of the screen. I don't even know if it works that way, but who knows? Okay, I think I'm back on my presentation now, and we are going to move forward. Unless I think I did see a few questions. Claire, is the biggest square mile or biggest by population?
So when you say biggest county for filing, is it biggest by population or biggest by square mile?
So it's the county with the greatest number of registered voters eligible to vote on the ballot question. That's going to be the one. Okay, so I think that covers questions thus far. A couple more notes on ballot question committees. I would note that one individual, unless it's a candidate, but that doesn't really apply here, does not constitute a committee. So that word as defined by the statute requires more than one individual, or it could be an entity or organization like a business, right? So one entity or more than one individual. And then I would say this is almost an exception to the general rule of establishing committees, right? So we talked about if you spend or receive $500 for the purposes of influencing an election, you have to register as a committee. Well, then under the MFSCA, they also say if you're a person other than a committee, so if you are not a committee and you make an independent expenditure to a ballot question committee, so you're not a committee, but you're making an expenditure to a committee, you are not required to form and register a committee unless you solicit or receive contributions for the purpose of making that expenditure. Now, when I say it, it sounds like a lot of words. So, and when I read it, I thought it was confusing. So I'm going to try to explain it more clearly. So me, Kendall, let's say I am a library official and I want to donate my personal funds, right? I want to make a personal donation to a ballot question committee. So I donate $400 to a ballot question committee that supports a millage that I want, right? Well, actually, let's say $650 because you're not actually required to make a committee until $500. So let's say my donation is $650. I make that to the ballot question committee, and that's it. I say, here's my donation, $650 in support of your ballot question committee. Am I required under the Act to then register and establish my own committee because I spent or received over $500 to influence the outcome of an election? Well, no, I don't have to establish my own committee. The gray area here, though, comes in if you are soliciting or receiving contributions to make that expenditure. So if I was going around to other individuals and I said, hey, I want to make a contribution to the ballot question committee, do you want to provide me with $10? And then I'll collect $10 from everyone, and then I will send that off to the ballot question committee. You may get into some trouble there. So with independent expenditures, you don't have to form your own committee unless you're soliciting or receiving contributions. So just note in your head that if I'm soliciting or receiving contributions, I may be getting into the area of a ballot question committee. I may need to take a step back and talk to my legal counsel. Okay, let's talk about Friends of the Library, right? Friends is, again, a separate and distinct group. So Friends are not the same as ballot question committees, and Friends are also separate and distinct from the library. Friends is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard that before. 501c3, it's a legal status of a nonprofit, right? So they're a nonprofit organization, and their stated purpose is to support and advocate for Michigan libraries. Now, kind of like what I mentioned at the offset, you know, there are a lot of ways in which these groups, the library, the committee, and the Friends group could work together. There are no set rules per se of behavior between working relationships of a library and the trustees and a Friends group, for example. I will say, while I was putting together this presentation, the Friends of the Library have a multitude of resources online with respect to establishing kind of rules of behavior that govern the general working relationship between the library and the Friends. I wanted to note that to the extent that you wanted to seek out those resources yourself. So they do have a multitude of resources on their website related to that. But for here, I kind of want to focus on, because our focus is on millage, right, and millages and millage campaigning, how do we work with Friends for millage campaigning? So I'm going to talk about a little bit that while I go forward. I'm going to talk about it from the library perspective under a statute, what you can do and how you can work with Friends. So I am going to get there. So I know you guys are probably saying, like, well, Kendall, tell me exactly how I can work with Friends. I wish it were that easy. I really do, but I kind of want to lay out this general framework for you, right? So nonprofit organization, keep that in mind, separate, no set of rules really govern that relationship, and they can lobby and advocate for a library, including through direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying would be an example of like influencing policy or legislation, bond issues, referenda, a budget, like that would be direct lobbying, right? And we're not really going to see that in terms of a specific millage. Grassroots lobbying would be if the group were attempting to get the public to do lobbying on its behalf, like setting up a call your senator type of advocacy, right? So Friends group can lobby and advocate for the library. I would say I don't know if there's going to be like a lot of direct lobbying happening for millage campaigns, but there may be support that Friend groups can provide with respect to specifically educating the public. So there are no limits for Friends groups with respect to educating the public. They regularly use their newsletter, write letters, publish information on their website, all to do that to educate the public with little to no cost, right? So to the extent that a Friends group is in support of a millage, they may be a great resource. The library can't, right? The Friends group can send out that education to the public. Like I'm trying to explain a little bit, the library is restricted from doing that. So the Friends group is kind of imperative here in educating the public. And then as kind of a final note on 501c3 organizations, just so kind of everyone knows, right? So like I said, nonprofit organization. In general, 501c3 organizations, they do have also their own limitations with respect to how much advocating and lobbying they can do. So keep in mind that not only do libraries have limitations, but then also these other groups may as well, friends and ballot question committees. So everyone may have, right, some legal parameters that they have to work by. And then if they're working together, ensure that all of those components are lawful and within the law. But 501c3 types of organizations specifically, they, like I said, they can't engage in lobbying, but if they engage in too much, they may risk losing their tax exempt status. So to the extent you're a library and you're saying, why can't you do more? Maybe perhaps recognize that they also have limitations. They don't want to lose their tax exempt status.
Kendall,
Yes.
there are many friends groups that are not necessarily 501c3s.
Oh, perfect. Well,
Just
okay.
just so there may be some that are may have some slightly more flexibility. I just wanted to clarify that because might get some questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. And you're right. There may be groups that, you know, when people say friends of the library, that's like a specific group, right? That is under the 501c3. Maybe there is just a local group of citizens that have assembled to kind of create a public citizens group that supports it. That may not be an actual Friends of the Library 501c3, you know, so they may have be under different legal requirements or entirely. So that was a great point. At the end of the day, rule of thumb. I thought this was a great rule of thumb. I found this on the Library of Michigan's resources, right, for advocating for political issues. And I said, why change what's perfect? Rule of thumb. The government, right, as a representative of all of their constituents, should be neutral with respect to matters of politics, since the people they serve each may have differing views. Therefore, public employees, while representing the government, should also maintain the neutrality despite their personal view. I want to bring this up because I'm going to get into section 57 of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act next to discuss kind of more particularly the rules surrounding public official and library actors engagement in millage campaigns. And so I kind of want to put this as our rule of thumb, right? When we're talking about anything with millages, millage campaigning, and when you're working with these groups, kind of come back to this when you're saying, I don't really know how to move forward. I remember that presentation Kendall gave me, but this seems a bit iffy, right? Come back to this rule of thumb and say, this is kind of where I need to be. And if it's not here, I need to have a reason why. Why can I stray from this rule of thumb, right? And then as a practical tip, I also say, keep in mind, even if your actions are lawful, not everyone is going to agree, or people might try to say, you know, I think that looked shady, or I thought that didn't look appropriate. So even if you're working within your legal parameters, there's no guarantee that people that oppose you will not raise questions or objections. So it's kind of something to keep in mind on maybe the political side, right, or the public side, the PR side of it. I am a lawyer, but I do think that's an important practical tip. Okay, section 57.
And up here from Jeffrey Babbitt, it's a couple entries up where it says, why wouldn't a person just solicit funds for the committee as a member of the committee? I'm not quite sure what that question's asking. Jeffrey, if you want to unmute and ask, you can.
So I understand, Jeffrey.
Oh, okay. You get it?
Yeah, if it's the committee that's soliciting funds, I don't have a concern. I was just raising, let's say myself, when I was giving that example, myself, I was not in the committee and I was soliciting funds for the purpose of providing those funds to the committee. That's when you have an issue. Okay, and then I see, so a director, or in our county, a school superintendent cannot go to a meeting and announce an upcoming millage. I think they can, and I will discuss Section 57 of the CFA, which we're going to get into a little bit. This says the friends group can't be the committee. I do think they're actually two separate groups. So if we're talking about the actual friends 501c3 groups, they are going to be different from a committee. Now, like I kind of mentioned, if it's a group of citizens that are supporting the ballot proposal or opposing it, and then they want to fundraise or be a vehicle for fundraising, they could establish a ballot question committee, right? So I would just say if it's a 501c3 group, friends group, it is going to be separate and distinct, and they cannot be the committee. Can the library director on her own time help the ballot committee with the paperwork, even though they are not on the committee itself? So I think that is also a yes, and I will explain why. So I think this is probably a good time to get into Section 57, because I think that's where the questions are heading, right? Like everyone's like, well, Kendall, then what can I do? So let's talk a little bit about Section 57 of the MCFA. Okay, so Section 57 of the MCFA, this is our groundwork for public officials or employees during a millage campaign, okay? And what I'm about to read to you really just relates back to our baseline neutrality point that I was just trying to advance, right? So Section 57, this is kind of our general rule, which I'll also summarize in the next paragraph. But this is what the statute says. A public body or a person acting for a public body they're prohibited from using or authorizing the use of funds or using public resources to make contributions or expenditures made for the purpose of influencing the qualification, passage, or defeat of a ballot question. All right, you said, Kendall, that's great. What do all those words mean? Well, I summarized it. So here's your general rule that I want, and I like right, you have to come at these issues with the idea of, well, we should be neutral, and then also here's the general rule under Section 57, which supports that neutrality kind of baseline argument, right? The library and any person acting on behalf of either the library or the library board is prohibited from using or authorizing the use of funds and public resources to make contributions or expenditures for the purpose of influencing the library's millage request. That is your general rule. Public resources, that can be pretty broad. That can include personnel, that can include office space, that can include computer software or hardware, property, stationery, postage, vehicles, equipment, supplies, right? So when I'm talking about public resources, that's a pretty broad term. And then, of course, use of funds, I'm talking about public funds. So the library's funds. The library and the library board, you're not going to be able to use those funds or those public resources to generally expend or contribute to, for example, a ballot question committee, right? Public body, of course, includes the library or library board. And then, like my slide says, there's 6 exceptions to this general rule, which we're going to go through. And I think you, for example, the chat, you're ahead of me. You guys are all smart. So you're like, Kendall, I think I know I can do it, but you're telling me I can't. You're just ahead of me, and I'll get there. Okay, I promise. So I thought it might be fun to do some true or false questions with everyone. And I was just thinking we could all raise our hands for if we think it's true. And then if you think it's false, you just keep your hand lowered. So I kind of like to keep these like a little bit more interactive for fun, you know, keep everyone engaged. So, excuse me, while I go through these exceptions, the way that I put this presentation together is I just put a bunch of examples or rate true and falses, and we're going to go through them together and test our knowledge. So, here we kind of just already went through our general rule, right? And so now I have a true or false based on this general rule. So true or false, a library may make an expenditure of public funds to a yes ballot campaign committee for purposes of supporting the passage of its millage request. And if you think yes, that is true, raise your hand. If you think no, Kendall, that's false, keep your hand lowered. Is where you're going to be able to raise your hand. Like I said, throughout this presentation, raise the hand is going to be the true, keeping it lowered is false. And I see absolutely no hands raised. Are we proud of ourselves? Yes, we are, right? Because this was false. This is false. No, you can't do this. The library cannot make an expenditure of public funds to a yes committee for purposes of supporting the passage of its millage request. Sorry, right? That's pretty straightforward. I feel like the general rule covers that, and you guys did great. Okay, I have another one. True or false? The library maintains a patron email list as part of its regular operations. A friends group in support of the library's millage question compiled supporting material, and they have requested that the library use its mailing list to distribute that material to the patrons on its behalf. The library would not violate the MCFA by doing so because the materials belong to the committee and not the library. True or false? Okay, this is what I get for presenting to library individuals, okay? Because you guys are all too smart for me. This is false, right? You can't do this, and I don't advise you to do it. So I think that really here you're getting into the question of using library public resources, kind of in violation of our general rule, right? Using public resources to make contributions or expenditures for the purposes of influencing the library's millage request. I think we're getting into the weeds there. We also have an additional court decision and state bar solicitation for political action committees, and that's 612 Northwest 2D 401 MISH 2000, if anyone wants that legal citation. And that case kind of does support the argument that this would be inappropriate. This would not be something that the library should do. So I do think that this would be a violation of the MCFA. Good point, Claire. Okay, exception number one, which I think you guys, right, have been kind of thinking about this already. So our exception to our general rule here is that the MCFA does permit the expression of views by an elected or appointed public official who has policy-making responsibilities, right? This, for example, would include your library board members. So if you are a library board member, you would be permitted to express your personal views on a millage proposal. So that, right, that is an exception to the general rule. And again, note that this is elected or appointed public officials, right? This does not include staff. So this is limited to elected or appointed public officials. I would say public resources, including library resources, should not be used to disseminate the personal information, or personal opinion. So even though, right, public officials do have this exemption, even though they are permitted to express their views on a millage proposal, I would not use public resources to kind of distribute that personal opinion. And then to really ensure against violations, best practice would be to indicate that the opinion is personal and that it's not an opinion of the library or the board at large. So someone asked, does this not include the library director? So I would have to go, and I will say, I do not know this off the top of my head, but I would have to determine for each type of library if the director is a public official or if they would be a staff. I think that they are staff technically, but if they're not a public official, this would not include the library director. Okay, so let's true or false again, everyone, because it's so fun, right? So true or false? A ballot question committee expended its own funds to create signs supporting the library's millage question. A library board member can display the sign at his or her personal residence. If you think this is true, raise your hand. If you think this is false, keep your hand lowered. Oh, okay, we're getting quite a lot of raised hands here. We also have some hands that are lowered still, which, okay, let's see then. Is this true or false? Right, this is true. I don't see an issue with this under the MCFA. We are not using public resources to create that sign, right? The ballot question committee created that sign, expended its own funds to create the sign. I said a library board member, right? So we do have this exemption about appointed or public officials that can express their views. And this is even additionally at their own personal residence. This is not even at the library. This is not at a library office, right? This is at their personal residence. So to me, I say, good. I don't have an issue with this. Okay, let's try another one. A library board member can use their personal cell phone to post on their Facebook their view on the library Millage's proposal while on the job. If you think this is true, go ahead and raise that hand. If you think this is false, keep that hand lower. Okay, I would say significantly fewer hands raised here, but I do think this is fine. Again, I don't see, sorry guys, right? We have a library board member. Under exemption number 1, library board members do have the ability to express their views on a millage proposal. Here they're using their personal cell phone. They're not using their library phone, right? So maybe if it was a library phone and or a library computer, perhaps we could be, again, getting into the weeds of, are we using public resources improperly to advance a right, a point or a position on a millage proposal, but we're not doing that here. We're using our personal cell phone and we're posting on our Facebook. And maybe what got people here is the on the job, right? And I will say, I'll explain a little bit more going forward, but you'll see this exception doesn't really make a distinction with regard to whether or not the public official is on the job or if they're in their personal time. So the way that we view this exception as kind of municipal lawyers, right, or people that apply this exception to a range of public bodies is that the public official here actually can be on the job, right, when they're expressing their views. So we say we're fine with this. I don't think there's an issue under the MCFA. Now, if this was an employee, let's say it was a staff member, so let's say it was a library employee using their personal cell phone to post on their Facebook about the library's millage proposal while on the job, that is not going to be permitted under the MCFA, right? Because we don't have this exception with respect to employees. I will explain a little bit early on as we go through exception number 6 that employees are permitted, right, to do some things in their own personal time, but while on the job, they are restricted under the MCFA, and while on the job, they should not be advocating for a library's millage proposal. Okay, so Michelle said, can they say vote yes during a board meeting? So if they are a public official with, let me go back to this. If they are a public official with policy-making responsibilities, I say they probably can, if an expression of their personal views. They should probably, again, though, indicate that the opinion is personal and not an opinion of the library or the board at large, right? And then also keep in mind my point about kind of PR and that side of this and the practical tip that I provided. Even if you're within the legal confines of the law, the public may still think that seems like a conflict of interest, or that seems like that's something that isn't permitted. So I agree with Claire, that can get very sticky. And so I think that's something that you're going to want to be careful on. Okay, moving forward. Okay, let's talk about exception number 2. Exception number 2 permits the production or dissemination of factual information concerning issues relevant to the function of the public body. So it is permissible to use library resources to create and distribute factual information. I think a lot of us are probably very familiar with this, right? I see a lot of FAQs kind of around millages, but we do want to be very careful here. There is a fine line between factual information and materials that are advocating for a millage. And it can be very challenging to make statements that do not advocate for a certain position. Even if you think, you might read it 10 times and think, Kendall, it doesn't advocate for anything. It is so neutral, right? No bias whatsoever. And I'll get that from a client and I'll say, I have bad news. I do think that we're crossing the line here, right? So I will say this is a fine line. But I will know, at least with regard to using library resources to create and distribute factual information, right? Library staff and employees, they can be involved in that preparation of factual information and materials. So library resources, but then also library staff and employees can be involved in that process of creating and distributing that factual information. Okay, and then I wanted to do, again, kind of true or false to kind of test this and give you guys an example. So true or false, is it permissible for a library to send out a mailer that simply encourages citizens to go vote and that does not contain any other information about the millage? Is it permissible? If you think yes, true, that is true, raise your hand. If you think, Kendall, I don't think that is true, and you're gonna leave your hand not raised. Okay. I think we have actually a good amount of hands raised, which is, I think, good, because I want to give a warning here, right? I would say you need to be careful here, actually. The takeaway that I want you guys to have for factual materials for this exception is that we really want to be limited to the language of the millage and kind of the basic facts about that language. And really the intent is to issue it for the purposes of objectively informing the voters, right? So you even want to avoid slogans like vote for your library, right? That is something that you are going to want to avoid. Support your library millage. Again, something you want to avoid. Even we need your vote, right? Something you're going to want to avoid. So that's why I put false here, because we're simply encouraging you to vote. I think even that, encouraging people to vote is not going to be something. We can encourage them to vote as long as we don't encourage them to vote for or against, right? Just vote. So I think yes, but I want to be clear though, like, so for example, if you're sending out a FAQ and it's all about the millage, but then you're indicating, go vote, go vote. I think you're in a little bit of a line there. If you're just saying, if people are just coming into the library and I don't know, you're saying vote, I don't know. I would say be careful. Again, you're going to want to avoid those slogans, right? Those slogans where you are kind of even encouraging people to vote for your library. Like anything like that is not going to be permissible. But if you say vote, it may be okay. So just kind of keep that in mind. So this is a great point. Many libraries offer voter registration services. How would you promote that service without mentioning the act of voting? So again, if we're kind of tying it to the millage, I think is where you're going to get in trouble here. So if you're tying the act of voting to the millage proposal, I think that's where you're going to get in trouble under the MCFA. If the library is just promoting voting in general, you might not even be under the MCFA here, right? So keep in mind, I'm talking specifically about under Section 57, and not like generally in terms of like your ability to advocate for voting, right, as a library. I'm just saying when you're under library millages. Exemption number 3, I wanted to bring up because I did note that there are 6 of them, right? But this is not one that I regularly see, although I just want to note it for you guys. Relates to the production or dissemination of debates, interviews, commentary, or information by a broadcasting station, newspaper, magazine, or other periodical or publication in the regular course of broadcasting or publication. Again, like I said, not an exemption I regularly see used for purposes of a library millage campaign. To the extent a publication is publishing material about a millage library campaign or proposal, right? And you're thinking, oh, well, I would still like to provide that, or maybe I want to email that out. I would be careful, right? We still have our restriction with respect to using public resources. So even if you're considering using this exemption, I think it's definitely something that you're going to want to contact your legal counsel about to ensure that you're doing it correctly. Okay, Exemption 4. This one permits the use of a public facility owned or leased by or on behalf of a public body if any candidate or committee has an equal opportunity to use the public facility, right? So with this one, it's really important. I just want to hit the point on the head is really just equal access and opportunity, right? So if you're going to provide access to facilities, you need to provide equal access to everyone. So a yes committee cannot be given special treatment. So let's do a true or false then, everyone. True or false? The library may allow a friends group to use a part of its building to hold its meetings, but if they do, they also must allow a no ballot committee group to host its meetings at the library. If you think this is true, raise your hand. If you think this is false, keep that hand lower. And I will say, I very much appreciate you guys participating in my hand raising. It keeps it a little bit more fun for me on this end as well, as I talk your guys' ears off. Okay, so I said yes, this is true. So if you're going to allow a friends group to use a part of its building, you're also going to have to allow a no group. This is just based on this exemption, right? There's a comment in the chat. This depends on the MOU. I think that you're referring to probably a separate agreement for leasing, at least for purposes of, there may be other considerations outside of this act that you need to consider, but at least for purposes of this exemption under the statute, right? For purposes of this true or false, equal access, if you're going to provide it to that friends group, you should also provide it to the no ballot committee. Exemption number 5. Like I said, 6, so we're getting there, guys. Thanks for hanging with me. So someone said, don't you have to provide it to the no group regardless? I do not think that we're under any general obligation to lease our library facilities to anyone. So like I said, if you're providing it to the yes, I think you have to provide it to the no. Yes, and then Claire, thank you for that comment, because again, it kind of goes back to my practical tip, right? When you're facing these gray areas, if it is contentious, there are going to be citizens that are looking for issues to pounce. Err on the side of caution. Absolutely. And that's why I mentioned that practical tip, right? Even if you think you might be in the bounds of the law, there might be public participants that think, I don't think you are, I think that looks bad, right? And sometimes even just the appearance of impropriety can really cause a disastrous effect on a Millage campaign.
Right. Especially right now with all of the book challenges and, you know, those activist groups coming to board meetings. And, you know, if you're doing a Millage now, you're better off just being as really straight and narrow as you possibly can.
Right, exactly. And like I said at the kind of beginning of this presentation, unfortunately, there's no easy way to give you guys direct examples of this is what you can and cannot do. Very black and white, right? I can't do that, but this is the framework. And so then when you bring this back to your library and you're trying to decide how we move forward, when you're planning out your Millage campaign, right, you can say, well, I think we're going to be able to do this. And then you can collaborate with your council and then other friends groups and your ballot question committee to ensure that your entire process, your entire campaign is lawful and within the parameters of the law. Okay. Now that I got that little rant out, let's go back to exemption number 1 or 5. Sorry. So this one permits the use of a public facility owned or leased or on behalf of a public body if that facility is primarily used as a family dwelling and is not used to conduct a fundraising event. Again, not an exemption regularly used for purposes of a library Millage campaign. I guess just note it, but it's not something that I see regularly used. Now, this one I think is also important. I think exemption number 1 that I talked about, and I don't know if I call them exemptions or exceptions, both work. But exemption number 6, okay, I talked about 1, which related to the public officials being able to express their views, their personal views on the ballot Millage proposals. Now, number 6 comes into play with respect to employees and then also public officials. So it encompasses both. So I would say public officials, right, have more room to kind of wiggle under the MCFA because they have that first exception, but they also have this one. Then with respect to employees, like I said, it's going to be limited to this exception. So here, This allows contributions or expenditures for an elected or appointed public official, right? Or an employee, so library staff, when they're not acting for the public body, so they cannot be acting for the public body, they're acting in their personal capacity. And then there's a few more elements here, right? It has to be on their own time. It has to be that they're expressing their own personal views. It has to be that they're expending their own personal funds, and they have to be providing their own personal volunteer services. So when I was talking about, for example, the Facebook post earlier, right? And I mentioned, well, if it's an employee and if they're on the clock, then that's going to be a violation of the MCFA. Well, here, right, like I said, if you're in your own personal time and you're expending it's your personal view and it's your own resources, your own funds, employees have First Amendment rights just like everyone else, right, when they're not at work. So they are able to engage with millage ballot committees and then also friends groups, right, like we've already discussed. But then again, keep that distinction in mind. It's separate and distinct from the library position. And the more you kind of keep that distinction, I think the easier it is to even kind of avoid complications in the MCFA because you're not then using public resources, right, or public funds. So if you kind of completely separate them, if you're just using your personal views, your personal funds, you're going to be okay under this exemption. I just gave you guys a lengthy explanation, but here it is again, right? Board members, the library director, the staff, the employees have a right on their own time and acting in their individual capacities to express their personal views, expend their personal funds, or volunteer their time. And then here's that kind of, right, that tricky part with public officials versus employees that I've discussed. Unlike the elected or appointed public officials, staff and employees, they're not going to be able to express their personal views while on the clock or during regular or normal business hours if they are salaried. Okay, I have another question. Can an employee on personal time use library Wi-Fi and pay for copies from the library copier to produce vote yes materials? Jeffrey, I would say I'm concerned about the potential use of public resources to do so. However, I think it's an interesting question because unfortunately it's right on the line. I think that if they're like a member of the public, right? Members of the public can technically come into the library and use the library's resources, including its Wi-Fi. So if they were acting in their own individual capacity, they were not on work time, right? They came in other hours and acting as in their individual capacity as a member of some type of committee, right? Use the public Wi-Fi to pay for copies. It may be permissible. It seems like it's maybe on the line, right? Maybe a little bit concerning. Let's talk a couple more true or false to elaborate on this point, right? So true or false. A local friends group has organized a cold calling campaign to get the word out about the library's upcoming millage vote. A library staff member may volunteer their personal time to participate in the cold calling campaign. If you think that's true, raise that hand. If you think that's false, keep that hand low. And look at all those hands raised. I see quite a lot, and I'm proud, right? Because this is true. I don't see an issue with this. Like we discussed, right? In their own personal time, in their own personal volunteer time, they can do this. They have no issue. Someone said, can they identify themselves as a library employee? So here's where I'd recommend that I keep that distinction separate. I would really try to keep employee activities right at the library and then kind of function as an independent, separate individual in your positions if you're going to work with these committees to the extent possible. Because I just think if not, I guess I don't have an issue with you identifying yourself as a library employee, right? But at the end of the day, you definitely want to ensure and make sure you understand that they're two different things. And really, at the end of the day, the library employee aspect, you should be keeping separate. And I think I have one more. True or false, everyone? A yes ballot campaign committee would like to run some ads in the local newspaper in support of the millage proposal. A library board member cannot donate $650 of their personal funds to the existing committee, but instead they have to establish and register their own committee. If you think this is true, raise your hand. If you think this is false, keep that hand lowered. And I know I'm asking you guys to go all the way back, right, to the very beginning of my presentation. And you're like, Kendall, we talked about ballot question committees briefly. And I'm like, I know, but I got to test you, right? So here I am doing that. And I see, okay, I see some hands raised, but some not. No, right? No, you don't have to establish your own committee here. Again, if they were soliciting those contributions for the purpose of providing that expenditure to the committee, we may have a different answer here. But with that exception for ballot committees, you would not have to establish your own committee. Okay. And I kind of wanted to touch on independent expenditures right after that, right? Okay, because you're like, well, then can I make an independent expenditure? Yeah, but I also want to note that there are additional requirements under the MCFA if you're going to do that with respect to independent expenditures. So any person other than a committee, so if you are not a ballot question committee, right, and you make an independent expenditure, advocating for the qualification. So if it's going to be for the qualification of the passage or the defeat of a ballot question, and if it's in the amount of more than $100.01 in a calendar year, you have to file a report for that independent expenditure. You need to file that report within 10 days of making the expenditure. So I did want to note that here, right? If you're going to make expenditures, be aware that there are reporting requirements still under the MCFA, even if you are not a ballot question committee. That report is just going to be made on a form provided by the Secretary of State, right? So you're going to be able to find it online. And then if you fail to file that report for more than 30 days after it is required, there are some penalties. So just be aware that penalties do exist with respect to violations of failure to file that form. The report that would be required to be submitted, it's going to just include the date of the expenditure, a description of the expenditure, the amount, the name and address of the person to whom it was paid. So if you're paying it to a ballot question committee, you have to indicate that. You also have to indicate the name and address of the person filing it. So if you are filing it, and then the name and address, occupation and employer, and principal place of business of each person that contributed to that expenditure. So if you are soliciting and some of that is not from your own funds, there is additional reporting requirements for even indicating who you receive those funds from. So keep this in mind to the extent that you are going to make an independent expenditure. Then I also wanted to bring up under Section 57 of the MCFA, right? We discussed our general rule under the MCFA, and I also talked about our 6 exceptions. I know this is not a fun way to end the presentation. I totally understand that, but I think it's important, right, for everyone to at least know and acknowledge that to the extent this is violated, that there are criminal and civil penalties. So again, this is kind of why we want to go back to that. If you're on the line, it's really better to perhaps just walk the straight and narrow, right? Make sure that you are within the law. For the criminal penalties here, it can be a possible misdemeanor and some fines. And then if the library violates it, it could also be a fine, possibly up to $20,000 or potentially even more if the amount of the improper contribution or expenditure is greater. So I think everyone would agree, right? The library cannot just go and provide a yes committee with $40,000 for support. But if they did that, right, they could potentially have a fine of $40,000 for doing so. So keep that in mind as well. And now I will take any and all questions that are still remaining. Melissa said, oh, perfect. Thank you, Claire.
If you want to unmute and talk, you can do that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure. I did see a question about a cash limit. I'm not sure.
Well, okay, in a cash limit, like for It's some organizations you could only give up to like $20 in cash. You can give more per check, like that $100 limit, but sometimes there's an actual cash limitation. I just wondered if that applied in this case too.
Here, I did not locate a specific cash limit that generally
Okay,
applied
thank
to
you.
free millages. Okay. I think we otherwise got all the questions answered as we went, so I don't think it's necessary to go back through the chat, but like Claire mentioned, yeah, I am free to answer the questions if you want to unmute and talk to me. Otherwise, if you want to send them in the chat, that's great too. Or if there's no remaining questions, it's been a pleasure to be able to present with you guys and talk about libraries, right? This is an important topic and we want to make sure that our libraries are funded.
Thank you. We really appreciate you coming out and talking to us, Kendall. That was excellent. That was really, really interesting. That was awesome. Thank you, Kendall. We very much appreciate you coming.
Of course. Thank you for the invite. Happy to present in the future again. So just let us know.
Oh, so we certainly will. So thanks a lot for coming. So I hope you all have a good rest of your week.